When we tell the story of fintech or modern finance, we would not be doing it justice if we did not tell the story of the people behind it, more precisely the generations of people behind it. The development of fintech, past, present and future, really is a generational thing, and this is where it has such relevance for you, as you watch this video and perhaps ponder your future career path. Indeed, it is your generation who will shape the future of fintech, and with it shape much more than financial services. The generations of interest are depicted in this simple graphic. The images can be taken as indicative of how members of each generation might look in the present. As we move from left to right, we have the baby boomers. Next we have Generation X or Gen X. Next the millennials or Gen Y. And finally, Gen Z, your generation. The year boundaries used to define generations are approximate, but they are close enough to be helpful. Baby Boomer refers to those born in the 2 decades or so following the end of World War II. This generation would bring us flower power and hippies. It also gave us tech giants such as Bill Gates of Microsoft and Windows, Steve Jobs of Apple, collectively personal computing, and Tim Berners-Lee, inventor of the World Wide Web, building on the already existing internet in a way that took it into the public domain. As a slight aside, all three were born in 1955, so clearly a good year for tech wine. Apple would go on to introduce the iPhone, probably still the best known of the smartphones. Personal computing and the World Wide Web, or the internet as we tend to use in short, laid the foundations for how we live and work our lives today. That was already the case before the world got sick in 2020, but the coronavirus pandemic has elevated remote working and business, and with it fintech, to a whole new level of significance. On top of this, we've had the smartphone evolution, fueled by the kind of computing power, if measured by processing speed, that only 20 years ago needed a building to house it, available only to national supercomputing labs or organisations of that ilk. Yet today we all have access to it and it fits in our pocket. The fact is illustrated here by comparing the latest generation of smartphones with the IBM supercomputer, pictured in the Livermore lab of University of California, Berkeley. A supercomputer assembled at the time to perform test simulations for nuclear weapons research. And here's a quote from Bill Gates himself, who is perhaps better known nowadays for philanthropy than tech, or fintech for that matter. We need banking, but we do not need banks anymore. Do you think someday we can open a bank account or ask for a loan without physically having to come into a bank? Now, given that this statement was made almost 30 years ago, and thus well over a decade before the appearance of Apple's first iPhone, it is pretty much on the money. Technically, we do still need banks, not least as entities who can store our money with trust. And that is not to understate the damage that the global financial crisis of 2007 and 2008 did to our trust of banks, which in itself is an important part of the fintech story. However, we certainly are better off keeping our money in the bank than under the bed. Indeed, the workings of national economies have banks at the core, as does global trade. Alas, we do very much still need banks. Nothing else in this quote from Bill Gates is up for debate though. As far as his reference to bank accounts and loans is concerned, mobile devices, mobile networks and the internet have seen to that. In fact, whilst on the topic of mobile devices, it would not be unreasonable to refer to the smartphone as the Fintech Machine. The price of mobile devices is dropping all the time, to the extent that 3.5 billion people worldwide, heading towards 50% of the population, have a smartphone, and almost 5.3 billion people, more than 2/3, have a mobile device. That is a much larger percentage than have an active bank account. And when it comes to mobile connections, we have more of those than there are people on the planet, at almost 10 billion. Around the same time that Gates, Jobs and Berners-Lee were born, the world of finance was seeing its fair share of innovation too. For instance, the credit card first appeared. Here are the first few. The Diners Club card from 1950 was technically a charge card, as the balance had to be paid in full at the end of each month. So American Express might be considered the first full-blooded credit card, and the first to appear in the UK was the Barclays card in the mid-60s. Now, if you were to look into how the earliest credit cards operated in practice and the underlying protracted complexity, it would hardly seem like a technological innovation by today's standards. But they really were a game changer in personal finance. This, together with other changes in the world of finance and investment, both technology and mentality related, leads naturally to considering the next generation of participant in the fintech evolution story. Generation X or Gen X. Perhaps best known as the greed is good generation, certainly as far as the financial services industry is concerned. Technological innovation continued apace through the 70s and 80s and onwards, and as with essentially any technology, it can be used to do good or not good depending on the user's intentions. The industry-wide mentality of greed, unapologetic self-interest, and irresponsible practices of the time is portrayed quite effectively in the film Wall Street, starring Michael Douglas as ruthless financier Gordon Gekko, here sporting the stereotypical braces. The film is also unfortunately credited with inspiring many aspiring Gordon Gekkos in real life. The culture of me would find its way to the core of banking and investment and precipitate the global financial crisis. Note the article in an issue of Fortune magazine dated May 2005, roughly 2.5 years before the collapse. A little prophetic in how it draws strong parallels between the practices of the day and the blockbuster Hollywood movie. Is greed still good, it asks. The hedge funds think so, and if Gordon Gekko was on Wall Street in 2005, they would eat him for breakfast. Now that is saying something. But that is the state the system had got itself into. The financial crisis that followed and its social and economic consequences from a fintech point of view is where the next generation enter proceedings. Generation Y, Gen Y, or the Millennials by their better known title.